This is a brief overview of the reading and math CRCT scores for the 2010 through 2013 school years. What we're doing is we're comparing Riverside Intermediate, our school, with the Cobb County School District as a whole, as well as the state of Georgia. This will help give us an idea on what we need to work on, how we compare and measure up to our county as well as the rest of the state. The data shared here will help isolate the problem areas for schools in reading and math. I'm focusing mainly on reading and math in these scores because those are our two problem areas. We seem to have the biggest issues with scores in reading and math, as well as those are the two critical areas in the 3rd and 5th grade CRCT scores. So that's what we're going to be focusing on here. What this is going to do is it'll help us create a learning plan to assist our students working with the weaknesses that are troubling them, as well as raising their learning and their test scores in the process. Like I said, we're not really focusing on science, social studies, or anything else because reading and math are the two large areas where we seem to have the most problems as a whole in our school. I know there's isolated pockets, but as a whole, we seem to have the most problems with these two subjects. Here are the scores for the 2010-2011 school year for math. As you can see, we have Riverside Intermediate, Cobb County School District, and the state of Georgia. And as you can see, our does not meet scores for math are much higher than both the state and the county. Our meet scores are more or less on par with the state or the county. They're a little bit lower, or excuse me, a little bit higher, but not too much. Our exceed scores are drastically lower than the state or the county. As you can see, they kind of match up with our does not meet scores. The does not meet scores are much higher, the exceed scores are much lower. Our meet scores are more or less on par with everyone else. The 2011-2012 school year, as you can see, for our does not meet scores, we're still much higher than the state and the county. Actually, the state and the county, if you look here, 19 and 17%, 15 and 11%, they actually went down. We went down too, from 42% to 30%. So that is some good news, but we're still much higher than everyone else. Our meet scores, again, more or less on par. We're a few percentage points behind the state, pretty similar to Cobb. Our exceed scores, as you can see, a little bit lower than Cobb or the state. Not as drastic as the 2010-2011 year, where we were 14%, Cobb was 44%, state was 41%. Here, we're catching up. 26%, 44%, and then 34% for the state. So lower, but not as low. The 2012-2013 school year, our does not meet scores actually, if you look here, 30% for last year, 29% for this year. So they stayed the same. The state and Cobb County, 14%, 10%, went down again. So while we did go down one more percentage point, we're still much higher than the state and the county. As far as meets, we're actually on par exactly with the state, and actually higher than Cobb County, so that is some good news. As you can see, the state and Riverside are both at 48%, Cobb County is at 43%. So we went from being 1 point behind them in meets to being 5 points ahead of them this year, so that is some great news. Exceeds, we actually went down a little bit, as you can see. The 2011-2012 school year, we were at 26. Now we're at 23. Still lower than Cobb County or the state, so that's again something we'll need to work on. Here are the math scores just from Riverside over the last 3 years so that we can see how our scores fluctuated. If you look at the meets, it went from 44 to 44 to 48. So our meet scores are actually stagnating. That 4% right there could be anything, but it's still only 4 points away from where we were 2 years ago. So we really need to work on our meets scores. The does not meet scores are some good news. It dropped from 42% to 30% to 29%. So the first year it made a 12-point drop. The next year it made a 1-point drop. So while it is still dropping, it looks like the drop might have slowed. So we'll need to work on that this year so that we can continue dropping that score a little bit more dramatically than 1 point at a time. The exceed scores, as you can see, go from 14 to 26 to 23. So while the first year it went up from 14 to 26, then the exceed scores went down from 26 to 23 again. So we need to reverse that trend and make sure that it continues going up instead of back down. Now we're going to look at the reading scores. Again, for the state, Cobb County, and Riverside Intermediate. As you can see, our does not meet scores are much higher than the state and Cobb, but not drastically higher like they were with math. We're at 14%, Cobb is at 10, the state was at 6. Meets is where we really seem to shine because we're actually higher than the state or Cobb. We scored a 71% of students that meet on the reading CRCT scores for this year. Cobb County and the state both tied with 54%. So we're significantly higher than they are. That's some good news. Exceeds, we're lower. We're 15%, Cobb is 37%, the state is 40%. So we need to work on raising our exceed scores, lowering our does not meet scores, and continuing the upward trend of our meets. For the 2011-2012 school year, again, I'll start off with this. You can see we are significantly higher than either the state or Cobb County. We're at 64%, Cobb County is at 49%, and the state is at 56%. So that's great news again the second year. If you look, we did go down from 71 to 64, but we are still above the state and the county average. We are still much higher on the does not meet scores. We did go up, as you can see, it's from 14% to 16% this year. In our exceeds, we're still much lower, 21%. Cobb County has 47, the state has 39. Here's the 2012-2013 school year, the most recent data we have. This is, again, encouraging news. The meets were still much higher than the state. The state was 52%, Cobb County was 44%, Riverside is 62%. So that's some great news. Exceeds, again, we're still much lower. 24%, Cobb County is 52, the state is 44. Our does not meets, we're still much higher. That seems to be a trend. We're much higher in the does not meets and lower in the exceeds. In this case, we are drastically lower. We're at 14%, Cobb County is at 3%, the state is at 5%. If you look at the previous year, the state was at 5, Cobb County was at 4. So the state stayed the same, Cobb County dropped a point. We were at 16, now we're at 14. So we dropped 2 points, which is good, but we're still much higher than the rest of the data. Here are the reading scores for Cobb County CRCT, or excuse me, for Riverside CRTC scores over the last 3 years. As you can see, the most troubling trend is that we have dropped our meet scores every year from 71% to 64% to 62%. So that is somewhat troubling. Our exceed scores have gone from 15 to 21% to 24%. So our exceed scores have gone up. Between the first and second year, they went up 6 points. Between the second and third year, they went up 3 points. So the gap is closing, so we need to remember to raise that. Our does not meet scores are stagnating. We're at 14% here. The second year we're at 16%. Third year we're at 14%. So there's really no statistical change anywhere. Here's a few strengths and weaknesses for both the math and the reading scores. Now our math does not meet scores have decreased from 42 to 29% in 3 years, while the meet scores have increased from 44 to 48% in 3 years. That's not a large gain, but it is a gain. The reading exceed scores have increased from 15 to 24% in 3 years. And the big strength for us is that Riverside has scored higher during the previous year in reading for the meet scores than either the state or Cobb County. Some of the weaknesses we have are that the math does not meet scores are much higher than the state or Cobb County for the most current year. And the math meet scores have pretty much stagnated for the last 3 years, very little change. The readings meet scores have dropped significantly over the last 3 years, from 71 to 62%. As I showed you, it's been a straight downward trend. And reading does not meet scores have stagnated as well for the last 3 years. If you remember, I showed you 14%, 16, and 14. So there's really no change there. So we have some scores that are going up, while others are either stagnating or dropping. So what we need to do is decide what can we do to stop the stagnation on both reading and math scores. How can we use this data to better equip our teachers and students to both learn more and raise scores next year? And how can the data team utilize this data appropriately and plan a course of action for the students and the teachers? What can we do with this data to raise the scores, but more importantly, help the students learn better and maybe correct some of their weaknesses and that they're having with the math and the reading? We need to use this data to determine what step we need to take next. Thank you.